Welcome, and on behalf of the industrial workers of the world, Spirit Revolt, the Radical Independent Book Fair and Glasgow's Anarchist Federation. Tonight I have the very great pleasure of introducing Manny Ness, Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. An author who probably needs very little or no introduction in his native United States, but possibly needs a little bit of an introduction here. Manny is the editor of the journal Working USA, probably, in my opinion at least, the best journal covering industrial relations from a critical left perspective out there at the moment, and certainly, again, only in my opinion, head and shoulders above most other academic journals in the field. Manny's had a very long interest in alternative forms of work or organisation. In point of fact, the first time I ever heard of his activity in his work was in 2003, when he was involved in the organisation of a conference in New York on alternate forms of work or organisation, alongside such people as Thornton Lind, Alexis Bustardin, General Secretary of the Secretary-Treasurer of the Industrial Workers of the World. In 2011, Manny edited a book called Ours to Master and to Own. It should be on your bookshelves, so I thoroughly recommend it. It's a collected essays on various forms of worker self-management, both during revolutionary periods and perhaps more controversially under capitalism itself in the form of nationalised industries under worker control and the cooperative movement. This year, Manny has edited a book on new forms of worker organisation, a particularly exciting volume, I suspect, in a brief look at the contents, and that's a survey of autonomous worker resistance to capitalist reconstruction in the 21st century. And it contains essays by that friend of Clydeside Industrial Workers of the World, Eric Foreman, and also by another wobbly based here in the UK, who is anonymous in this and shall remain anonymous, but Jack Kirkpatrick, I believe he is going on with the name of. But really, you didn't come here to listen to me, because you can hear my pitch any old time, so I will, without any further ado, hand over to Manny, who will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then we shall open up to a open discussion.
Thank you, Jack. I really appreciate the invitation to come to Scotland and Glasgow in particular. I'm really indebted to everyone here for attending this forum, and very grateful to the organizations that you've all discussed and noted that are part of this group, and thank you all for that. I have a presentation that I'm going to make, but I think I'm going to go off my presentation so that we can have a discussion. I'd like to start by saying that we are now a few months away from the 110th anniversary of the foundation of the Industrial Workers of the World. Next July, we will have 110 years of IWW in existence. And throughout that period, the IWW has remained an inspirational organization that has had an effect that extends beyond the organization itself. We have many IWW-type unions and workers' organizations that may not take on the name of the IWW, but in fact represent the actual character of rank-and-file unionism that is at its center. And I'd also like to say that there is a tremendous amount of possibility for expansion of an autonomous, independent union movement that's founded on IWW principles of solidarity, principles that are rooted in a rank-and-file based organization that can contain a degree of power, and we can actually look upon as a present and especially a future organization, especially now as we see existing unions declining in their relevance. I have tried over the last 30 or more years to work with unions of all kinds. And at the same time, I've also met with many types of opposition within existing and traditional unions, as many of you here have also experienced in a profound way in your everyday lives. I've spoken to some of you here. And one point that I would make is that we can still have those kinds of organizations. I was speaking to one of your comrades here, and he mentioned that he's a member of several organizations or one union, but also a wobbly, and people ask, oh, why are you a wobbly? What's that? What does that have to do with anything? And in fact, the actuality of being a member of the IWW does make a difference. It does present the possibility that people can, in fact, inject IWW principles within their rank and file organizations that are in existing unions. But I'd also like to say that IWW unions can, in fact, consolidate power through rank and file action, and they can become the model for a future unionism. One point that I like to kind of refrain in terms of how we can conceive of existing unions is that something that Eric Foreman spoke of. He referred to existing unions as dinosaurs. And I remember commenting to Eric and saying, you know, that's true, but I think existing unions are dinosaurs because they are a legacy of, millions of years past. But I think we could probably go back to a more recent ancestor as opposed to a different species entirely that is not even a mammal. And we can go back to Neanderthals as a reference to existing unions. And the fact is that IWW members and IWW fellow travelers are not seeking to destroy existing unions. We agree in working class solidarity, irrespective of the union, if that union will allow us to engage in it. But I think that IWW unions are, in fact, the principles that are rooted in IWW unions that are based on solidarity, based on syndicalism, and rank and file activity are the wave of the future. But what I was going to say is that there's more of a resemblance in existing unions to Neanderthals. I don't know if any of you have heard that you can now find out what your immediate ancestorship is. And many of us, I haven't checked my own, are in fact partially Neanderthal, which means that it's in our DNA to have some kind of that species. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being Neanderthal, but I would say that with respect to unions, there is a parallel in the sense that existing unions will remain part of the DNA for quite some time. And we can conceive, practically speaking, this is not some kind of transformative moment, of seeing these existing unions continue and forming a large, one big union that's rooted in IWW formations and actual union membership with people paying dues directly to the union without a checkoff or anything like that. I am going to say that existing unions have, in fact, been under assault, and we should not attack them for that reason. But I believe that many of the reasons for this, as others do, as Stoughton Mint and Daniel Gross and other members of the IWW and people who consider the significance of rank and file autonomy and rank and file solidarity, are very keen to recognize that unions today are rooted in a compromise that took place sometime between the last 50 and 100 years, depending on which country we're in. And in the United States, that compromise took place in the 1930s, and it was one that was flawed at the very beginning. In fact, I want to go even back to the various types of settlements that were made with a government that was not intent necessarily on creating a union that would be strong and powerful, but interested in fact, ensuring that those unions that organized were certainly secondary, if not under the thumb of management in the state. And here in itself, at the very origins of unions, wherever we are, whether it's the United States, whether it's China, whether it's South Africa, Brazil, etc., where you have very exciting unions in certain places that existed over the years. And I do think there are differences between the two, because in one case we're dealing with a global center, the imperial center, in other cases with countries that have fought against imperialism, with workers that had as well. Yet at the same time, these unions have engaged in a corporatist type alliance with management in every case. And it breaks all our hearts to see these unions that once were founded in militant workers' organization, democratic action, rank and file protests, wildcat strikes, direct action, general strikes, and so forth, be reduced to a bare shadow of what they once were. In this case, we can actually pinpoint the specific moments in history that exist in every one of these countries. This country, the UK, etc. If there's separate countries, that's up to you. The point I'm making is that we have a number of historical moments that we can say, aha, there is where we would like to go back to, or maybe achieve in the future. And those elements are significant. So for instance, in many of the cases in the United States, for instance, people go back to the 1930s industrial movement where you had sit-down strikes. Here too, in the 1960s and early 70s, you had a wave of sit-down strikes that were incredibly inspiring to us all throughout the world. In industries that range from dock workers to aerospace to motorcycle developers, you had actually a militant working class movement that in many instances wanted to achieve power, but were constantly stopped in different moments. I'm not going to get into the specifics. However, one thing that I think, one thing that's quite important, and I recently finished an introduction to the new volume of Stoughton Lynn's Solidarity Unionism, which is coming out next year as part of the anniversary of the IWW's 110th year of existence. And one thing that came to mind is that we see a decline in these kinds of organizations in places such as North America, Western Europe, and advanced capitalist countries. And I don't think that's necessarily an absolute. We have examples of very inspiring cases of migrant workers going on strike, adjunct professors going on strike, teachers struggling for equivalence and strong conditions over periods of time. But what I would say is that there seems to be a great degree of new workers' mobilization that's taking place in Asia, Africa, South Asia, and Latin America that is outside the bounds of traditional unions. And this takes place after the compromises that take place in each country. You know, you think about it. You had the Workers' Party and the Workers' movement in Brazil that made compromises. Yes, they made some gains with the various programs that guaranteed family wages. You had the case of South Africa that you have the end of apartheid, which is a great and momentous achievement, and yet workers were not part of that compromise necessarily. Yes, the workers' movement leadership was, but the workers themselves were not. In India, you don't have an immediate example that compares to Brazil and South Africa, but you certainly do have the emergence of a major insurgency outside of traditional unions, sometimes supported by them, sometimes not. But what's interesting is that we have these new union formations that might as well, in many cases, be labeled autonomist or syndicalist unions. And by that I mean unions that are either independent of the existing force. Some people refer to them as council communists, as the model in Germany in 1918, 17, 18, and 19 evokes, before the revolution and after, where you had a union that didn't care about its rank and file, they just were interested in political action, and the rank and file engaged in direct mobilization to defend workers against management oppression. The same kinds of things we can see taking place in, for example, let's say South Africa, where today, I think this week, you read the newspapers, we have the end of a 21-week-old strike that is amongst 60 to 70,000 platinum mine workers, many of them from the entire region of southern Africa, which makes South Africa, according to most analysts, the most militant country in the world. Yes, this is the same country where the COSATU is a major federation and part of the government alliance, the tripartite alliance. Yet there is a movement that many people may not find too comfortable, that may not actually have the ideas of a left perspective, perhaps, but it is a union movement that is pushing unions to support their interests. If unions do not support them, the unions go. And this is in fact the case with respect to the National Union of Mine Workers, which had a major strike in 1987. And I don't want to denigrate any of those strikes because they're very important. But today, from 2009 to the present, there has been a new insurgency in the mines and also other sectors of the economy that has been transformative. We all remember the 2012 August massacre of mine workers, which was tragic at Maracana. And these are the same mine workers who were making less than the equivalent of $200, forgive me, 200 pounds a month, who are now doubling those wages at least, and just agreed to a 20% wage increase. They demanded a wage increase that was 3 times their salaries. The union had to accept that kind of demand. And going on a 21-week strike means you are taking upon yourself a tremendous amount of burden. The burden of supporting yourself and your family, the burden of social reproduction, the burden of having to pay back debts and so forth. These strikes were pushed forward by the workers, and the union, in this case, had to support their demands and also negotiate on their behalf. In fact, there are many instances, if you read transcripts from the Maracana Commission and elsewhere, where the union chief is begging the workers to end their strike, and this is in 2009, which was a tragic event, forgive me, 2012, 2 years ago in Maracana. A tragic event, but the workers said, no, we're staying here, and the same very day these workers were massacred, 34 of them. What I'm trying to convey is the fact that it's the workers that are pushing the union. And in this case, yes, it would be great if these workers were able to consolidate an IWW-style union. In fact, Lucien van der Walt has done a lot of work in this area, as well as others that have written about this. Lucien is a Wobbly and recognizes the importance of these unions. And while we can't say that the workers themselves are a member of any organization, they do have workers' assemblies, and they are on strike, and they are pushing for demands that it was as recent as 3 weeks ago. The South African major companies, many of them based, multinational companies based in the UK, London, said, we're going to get out of the business of platinum production, which, if anyone believes that, you can sell them, as we would say in New York, at Brooklyn Bridge, because of course they would lose platinum to a workers' strike. I want to make a few more words about the Indian case, and I'll close with that because my time might stay within the 15 minutes designated. There are many other examples, as Deck pointed out, and I can talk to each of them. And before I turn to the Indian case, I want to say that each of those examples was purposely given to people who actually live in those countries in most instances, rather than people who are writing from afar and are not necessarily completely integrated into these movements. And certainly there's the case of the cleaners branch of the UK, and we do have the other example that was written by Eric Foreman on the Jimmy John's IWW Workers Union. In India, too, we have the formation of countless workers' unions. Now, what to make of this? What is this workers' union? It sounds like something that's out of the IWW, but yet there is the formation of organizations that are not necessarily the Congress Union, or not necessarily the Hindu Union, or the other unions that are affiliated with communist parties, but they're independent unions that are forming in city after city, industrial belts throughout the country that are dedicated to autonomous types of unionism. They're doing so for a variety of reasons. First of all, unions are not recognized in many of these cases, established unions, which offers an opportunity for these workers to advance themselves. But there's another issue that also deals with the question of solidarity, and that is that in India, as is increasingly other parts of the world, including the UK, Scotland, continental Europe, and North America, we're finding the case that we have a lot of contract workers. It means that we can be working at the same shop and doing the precise same work, and you have one group of people who are making 1/10 as much as we are. I can say that's true certainly in my job, where faculty members who are full-timers make 5-10 times as much as part-timers a year. And I wonder myself, how can I actually justify doing nothing after seeing workers in India saying that, you know, we're not going to do that. We will risk going to jail, we'll risk losing our jobs, we'll risk house and home to fight for solidarity on the job, meaning that we want the person working on our, side by side with us who doesn't have a permanency. Many people refer to it as precarious workers, but I would call them proletarianized laborers who are highly experienced, who are just as good as the full-time workers, just as I can say a person who is a part-time faculty member is just as good, if not better than I am, in terms of their teaching abilities, who have demands. And if I were really truly interested in solidarity as an Indian auto worker, I'd say, if I want to protect my job, I have to protect her job, or his job, whoever that worker is, to ensure that that person also has the same conditions as I, and I'm demanding better conditions, has the same permanency on the job, and that we will engage in direct action against the employer, since the employer isn't recognizing us. In some ways, ironically, the failure or the objection of employers and the state to recognize unions is allowing an opening to take place. We no longer have to consort with management in the same way. If you don't recognize me, that's good. That means I'll fight you, or with my comrades in solidarity. And I think this is a hopeful perspective. It is not pessimistic at all. I think we are now facing a period of time where the state and employers don't want to recognize us. If that's the case, we will engage in the kinds of militancy that is certainly rooted in the kinds of IWW actions that we are here today to discuss. Anyway, thank you very much again, everyone, for having me. It's been a pleasure to have this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and suggestions.
I have one hand up right away, so Susan, if you'd like to.
Okay, I'd like to start off with the history of the IWW. In the mid-90s, I joined the IWW in Western Massachusetts and also the Socialist Party USA, and their histories intertwine. And I felt at that point that I sort of reached I had all I needed for my political work, and also I was a child care worker, so I was in a UAW local. So I was a dual carder. So, to me from the beginning, sort of my more recent politicalization, to have the radical union part and the revolutionary socialist part just made so much sense. And I felt that you know, that I could do so much more that way than if I had either individually. So kind of my question is, and I'm trying to deal with this in terms of the situation here in Scotland, because we've started a Scottish Education Workers Network along the industrial organizing model, and bringing in campaigning as well as workplace issues and so on. But in your experience with radical unions, is there this political component? I mean, is there a sense, or is it encouraged, or, you know, that the radical unionizing is a part of a revolutionary global movement? And, you know, if this is happening, how is it manifesting?
I think that's an important point. I kind of alluded to it with respect to South Africa, where the union actually is called the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, and it emerged out of the coal mining industry. And at one point, they asked for affiliation with COSATU. COSATU said no, and in fact, they're part of an organization that's not necessarily radical in the sense a socialist revolutionary organization. However, there are other examples where you can find that. I'm thinking of the precise examples. For instance, in Russia, you have anarchist-based organizations that are expanding in strike activity in the mining sector, auto sector, and other areas that have proliferated. You have other examples in Colombia, which I think is a very important essay by Avi Chomsky, where you have a union that's concerned with the ecological status of the community. Citra Kabong is a coal mining union. It represents workers in that industry, and the workers actually are engaging in direct action on a regular basis. What their concerns are not just with their own status, but they're also interested in the community as a whole. And in this case, I consider that, we want to use the term radical or left and so forth, that's okay, but I think that's a holistic approach that says that we as workers care about the indigenous people who live in our community and region, and we want to ensure that that community can breathe clean air, can exist and sustain itself and so forth. I consider that, and will strike on that basis or engage in direct action against their employer. The cases are diverse. For instance, in the China example, we have unions that are obviously not able to formally exist in the same way as they do in this country or in other countries in the West, because they are affiliated with the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which is a party union, and they're engaging in direct action, notwithstanding a political force. But certainly I would say that the impulses are clearly rooted in solidarity, rooted in a leftist, I don't know if that's left or right, but I think it's an important idea. That's why it's difficult for me to say. But just this last week, we had a case where the representative for Walmart, a high-level union employer representation lawyer, was arguing with workers who were laid off at a local Walmart. So over 100 workers, I think there were 69 workers still in litigation, and the workers were claiming that they had a right to have a job and so forth. And this is a more recent example of the insurgencies that are taking place in China. Would you call that left or right? I don't know. But I call it, I mean, maybe we can say here that worker solidarity is a natural force that workers engage in. And the idea is, with respect to the IWW, let's say, is to create an organization that's viable, that can represent workers, that is democratic and accountable, where union dues are paid not to management or not through management, but directly to the union. It's very difficult, as people like Daniel Gross have argued, but I think it is necessary, and certainly possible and necessary, if you want to build lasting organizations. We can't depend on agreements between what may appear to be third parties in some cases. I'm not saying they're all the same, because unions are diverse. These third-party organizations and management to say, we represent the workers, and at the same time negotiate concession after concession after concession. Maybe because they feel they don't have any power. Maybe because the state does not allow people to go on strike, which is usually frequently the case. I'm not saying they're not reasons, but I am, and I think we perhaps could have a very interesting discussion, suggesting that if workers did not have the kind of the chain of these various labor laws, if you call my strike illegal, that might be a good thing, because I don't care that I'll go on strike and let's see who has the power. Obviously, you can do some of the things pragmatically, but that's my sort of my perspective. There are other examples, certainly drawn from Australia, where you do have left groups. Many of them are actually autonomists. I think that's, I don't know how we would characterize the IWW in the UK and Scotland. In the United States, certainly there's, a lot of young people involved in the IWW. We call it a leftist group, but what kind is another question. I also would argue that I'm not looking for a sectarian perspective necessarily. I don't know which group is right. I also implied in my, forgive me for going on for too long, but I just ended it, implied that I think there is a significant question of imperialism that we have to address in most of the cases of worker struggles. Especially now, I was going to cite that the 70% of all industrial workers in the planet, maybe more, I think it's approaching 80%, are in the global south. And that I couldn't say that 5 years ago.
I've got a question, but on the thinking about whether things are left and right, I think maybe also, do you think it's useful also to think of whether things are authoritarian, libertarian? In some ways that's possibly as important as to whether it's left or right.
Yeah, I think you're making the point, and I agree completely with you. I think in this instance I would say that obviously you have to take a look at the configurations in each place, each country, each region, and that the kinds of unions that we're talking about here reflect the kind of, if you want to use the term libertarian, I would say democratic impulses of the workers, as opposed to the authoritarian types of unions, in many cases, that exist where we live and throughout the world. That's changing, and I think this is an opening. That's what I think that's a very good point, rather than question, if I can.
Yeah, and just my question, I suppose, or maybe an observation, is I was quite interested in what you were saying about workers in China actually operating outside the trade union. And I suppose my own thoughts, and I'm interested what you think, is that probably what we know from our own experience is that people and communities know how to organise. It's a set of circumstances that they come together. And certainly I'm a member, of being a steward in one of the larger, what you call the third-party trade unions, and in fact we have an issue at work at the moment about terms and conditions, and we have been trying to get the union to negotiate on our behalf. We don't have a steward, but I was mandated to be part of the negotiating team. But the union are basically trying to just get it fixed. However, they are quite busy with other things, so we've actually mandated a couple of people from our workplace to negotiate directly with the union, with the management, and we've cut out the union. So, and I suspect that sort of thing happens quite a lot. I know someone else here who also is very much an organiser, but not actually like to steward in a workplace, sort of semi-union, but actually represents within the structure, I suppose, but not as part of the union, and not accountable to the union, but more accountable to the people in their workplace who meet. And I don't know whether you find that experience elsewhere.
Yes, I think I would argue that shop stewards ideally are elected by their the workers on the shop floor. And that should not be controlled by the overarching union. I know a number of unions where the union leadership, the central leadership, makes the decisions on who will be the shop stewards, and who will run, and who can't run, and who can get elected and who won't. and there's a large degree of discipline in those organizations. I think where there's greater levels of possibility is certainly where you, I think the ideal case would be where you actually do have a democratic shop steward system, and the fact that where you have unions, as I was mentioning before, such as the Council Communist types in Germany during the German Revolution, where the established union doesn't really know or care what's going on, where it opens up the possibility for this direct rank and file, if you put it, libertarian types of activity, or authentic rank and file activity is the way I would perhaps prefer to call it. But yeah, I think that's, there are a lot of examples, and they're all in this collection, and there are many more even beyond this collection that are developing. And I'm not talking about narrow cases. You brought up, very briefly the China case. We just had hundreds of thousands of workers on strike in various sectors this last spring, including Nike, Adidas, and other workers who are critical to the production of these athletic shoes. And they did so without, they had to have some kind of shop steward representation, some type of, I'm not going to say leadership structure, but some kind of rank and file organization that exists outside of the union. What Stoughton Lynn refers to as parallel unions in some ways, and I actually do. I take parallel unions, I discussed this with Stoughton Lynn too, as not only to reflect these overarching bodies, but actually they exist side by side. They're the actual union as opposed to the official union. And I think that's what I think you're trying to allude to.
Yes, I think so. I think you summed it up very well as being a parallel structure. I didn't want to give the impression we can't elect your own stewards, by the way we can, but for various reasons.
I once wanted to title the book Parallel Unions. It's a book I wrote on migrant worker militancy in New York City. And the publisher said, no one will understand what it means, but I thought it was a better title. And it precisely reflects this kind of inherent, ineluctable force amongst workers.
Thank you.
Margaret?
Okay. Thanks for your talk. I'd like to know the difference between colonised nations that are a product of Western imperialism. I'd like to know the difference between their history, their evolution with Western countries, especially with regard to government interference, and also their power structures relative to the difference in the hierarchy of power structures.
Difference between completely clear.
So
I could speak to it, I want to be precise as possible.
Just I suppose two things. Just, you know how you were saying in South Africa, in countries that were formerly colonised due to Western imperialism, is that often their power structures, like who's leader, who isn't, the hierarchy of leadership and stuff is different. I just wondered in what ways is it different. But I'd also like to know, because in these colonised nations, they all are formed through struggle, and then afterwards the IMF and World Bank implements debt. So they have this debt there. They also have people in power that generally are elected. If the West doesn't like them, then they'll remove them sometimes, like Patrick Lumumba in Congo, and the leader in Chile, or lots of countries. So I wondered, in a country like that, how do the leaders of that are sort of appointed by the West deal with unions? I suppose.
Oh, okay. I think very briefly. I think Albert Manny has written, and Fanon obviously talks about the colonization of the mind. In this case, I would argue that, and I think we all probably can contribute in some ways, that cases like South Africa, India, less so Brazil, but these countries that actually had forces there over the last, administrators over the last 150 to 200 years, are inheriting the precise systems that existed before this. For instance, the Commonwealth states, they all have parliamentary type systems, and by extension, many of them have parliamentary unions that are affiliated with one of the other parties, and they're able to get their power through these leaders that rose to the top, in many cases through anti-colonial struggles and so forth. And I would argue in the difference between that and obviously the imperial center is that you may also have parliamentary unions and the same kind of structure. However, you have, in many cases, I would say one population is much more exploited and oppressed. And that what's happening now is that these parliamentary systems aren't necessarily working. In places like South Africa, you have a tripartite agreement with the South African Communist Party, the African National Congress, and COSATU, part of this organization that leads government. But they're so intertwined with the leadership that they don't have any autonomy whatsoever. And vice versa. For instance, the National Union of Mine Workers is beholden to this structure, and also COSATU, and they are benefiting themselves. In many instances, there's a degree to which they're benefiting financially and economically through the system, and this is all documented with respect to the National Union of Mine Workers, through a system of oppressing workers, denying them actually the right to increased wages, especially migrant workers in South Africa. And you have an entrenched leadership that takes power in case after case. But I see a shift taking place. Many people refer to South Africa as I said earlier, as a very important case study because we're beginning to see that change. Whether COSATU can hold on power, many people are saying it may not. There's another union in addition to AMCU called NUMSA that people may be familiar with that is actually trying to form a workers' party against the existing state. It no longer has, it broke off with COSATU. And this is leading to some of the transformations. But I would argue they're being pushed by workers themselves. Same thing with India and other states where you have this erosion of parliamentarism, where the parliamentary unions aren't able to deliver for the workers anymore. Can you imagine in India, the Lok Sabha, their parliament has over 500 members and only 9 from the CPMI, the Communist Party, India Marxist or Maoist. That was a leading force. It was able to mobilize a lot of support for their members, which may not have been for everyone, obviously. And this is forcing people to say, no, you don't have any power anymore. These parties, these groups have been marginalized. I'm not going to say that it may not come back. They've been hurt badly in the last 8 to 12 years, and consequently you have the emergence of these new forms. I would say the main difference between the imperial world and the rest is that I think we have more industrial workers. In dramatic numbers. I think you asked such a very big and profound question. I think we can devote so much more time to it. I wish others could make a comment if they have examples or ideas or disagreements with this perspective.
Got Dick, thanks, I think.
Were you going to come? Who have you got after me?
Dick, and then Eric, and then maybe take a quick break to take 5 minutes to catch some air. It's quite warm in here.
Right. Well, everyone's before me, because they haven't spoken, so.
Okay.
Well, I think when we look at the history of the IWW, what's interesting about the IWW is not just that it was a democratic militant union. Those are not common in U.S. history, but they're not completely unique either. But what was different about the IWW was that it was a consciously radical union. That is, the people who were activists in it all considered themselves to be socialists or anarchists, mostly socialists. And they saw the IWW as an important part of building a movement that would overthrow capitalism. there was no secret about this. Their newspapers made this point all the time. That was an important part of what they did. They were anti-imperialist. They fought U.S. imperialism over and over again, and that was one prime reason they were destroyed. So it was a very conscious political, not in the sense of partisan political, but political in the sense of a vision of an alternative society. And that's an important point. I don't think you can overlook that. So if to say that things are IWW-like unions, if that has any real meaning, should mean that they are on the left. That was exactly the point of the IWW, that it was a radical union. So that's one point. Two, in terms of Scotland and the UK, I think what's happened here, it's true the private sector is largely unorganized, but where you really see the most things going on, there are existing unions. In the public sector, construction, these are places where you have some militancy going on, and it isn't that there's no union. There is a union there. It's a whole big bureaucracy, often Unite, which has a huge bureaucracy. And so the question is, what do you do about it? And I think to do that, you're going to have more than an insurgency. That's obviously part of it. A rank and file insurgency, democracy, all those kinds of things. You're going to have some political vision. Because to give the Unite leadership credit, they actually do have a political vision. They'll tell you their political vision. They don't keep it a secret either. And it's a social democratic reformist vision of what society should be like. If you're going to counter that, you've got to have an alternative vision. You can't just say more. That's not going to do. Because actually the Unite people actually have a vision of how this all fits together. And I think that is something that we need to think about. And looking both in the history of the IWW and also where we are at, is how do you create a dynamic rank and file union movement that actually has an alternative radical vision, presents an alternative program to the kind of social democratic top-down reformism that the existing unions do. And I think that is where we're at. And one final point, I think if you look at the history of the British trade union movement, there's been a lot of shop steward movements, strong shop steward movements. The trouble is, first, they have not had a clear alternative vision often, and second, they have not really broken with the existing unions. And I think at some point, you can't just be a parallel union. If at some point you become strong enough, either shit or get off the pot. At some point you have to move on and say, we are the union. We are the union. We are going to break from Unite and all that kind of crap and create a different union. And that's tough for us to envision now, but I think that if you look historically, that's really what a major failing has been in Scotland and throughout the UK. They've never really reached that point. And because of that, the existing unions have co-opted them back in.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I was making the point earlier. I completely concur. I think we have to have I didn't want to use the term discipline, but the IWW had discipline to it. It was one big union. The union was anti-capitalist. It opposed the state. It did not believe in collective bargaining with management whatsoever. Every strike was immediate in terms of the benefit, and was militant in that way. And what I'm trying to put forward is the idea of what is the hope for the future? How do we transform this? And I think you raised a very important question, to me anyway. And it made me think, how do we transform, or what is the plan to transform these types of organizations? They are coming into being, into more militant, democratic and disciplined in terms of a vision for socialism that will have an effect. I'm extremely excited about these new organizations that are forming. They do represent the kind of class consciousness that we'd like to see. The question is consolidating that into a rank and file, and if you will, left movement. Sometimes I don't want to be sectarian, that's why I don't want to use the term left, because everybody has their own vision perhaps. But a working class movement that's based on IWW principles, which you put forward. I agree with you fully. I think that's the next step. How do we get there is the conundrum for all of us. For me, anyway. And I'm searching for ways, I think we all are. I agree completely.
Yeah, I mean, kind of related to that in some ways. I mean, I've been involved in the sort of labour movement, the trade union movement for knocking on 30 years now. I've been a shop steward and I've been involved in sort of rank and file type activity in various unions. But I've also been involved in the libertarian left in the broadest sense, the kind of anarchist and syndicalist type organisations and movements over the last 30 years. And it seems to me, certainly when I was first involved, there was absolutely no impact of syndicalist, libertarian type ideas at all in the British labour movement. It had existed back in the 1910s, until to some extent, the early 20s or whatever, and it seemed to disappear. So syndicalism, for a very, very, very long time, had become, in a sense, irrelevant, perhaps, to the vast majority of rank and file trade unionists, and like a dirty word to people on what you might call the Leninist left, because it was seen as this kind of unsophisticated, apolitical kind of movement that lacked any real seriousness in terms of political leadership and so forth. And the notion is therefore that the Bolshevik kind of model, this kind of top-down Leninist kind of model, was a massive step forward on that, and it left syndicalism behind and so forth. So you've got kind of like a rank and file that never heard of syndicalism for 70 years or whatever, and you've got a left in the trade union movement that's militantly anti-syndicalist when it knows about it. Now it seems to me that's kind of changing a little bit. I think syndicalism is becoming something that people have to discuss. So for example, some of the kind of labour movement renewal think tanks on the global level, like the Global Labour Institute and the Global Labour Journal, which is not connected, but just have to have similar name, they're starting to kind of take syndicalism seriously and invite syndicalists to speak to their conferences internationally. And it seems to me that that's kind of happening up here in a sense, and the kind of higher levels of debate within the international labour movement. But that it's not necessarily happening that much, certainly not in this country, I think, on a lower level. So although I think syndicalists have a higher profile in this country than they ever have in my lifetime, and I think certainly since the 1920s, that the kind of debate isn't quite out there yet. We haven't quite captured that sort of imagination. And I think it is in some ways beginning to happen. I think there are definite syndicalist type tendencies within the RMT union, for example. They're not really explicit, but they're kind of almost implicit. But it's how do we, and this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we kind of make that kind of thing explicit? How do we posit it as a serious alternative to the kind of social democratic vision that dominates the labour movement? labourism, basically. How do we make that a kind of a living alternative? And I think until we do, a bit like you're saying there, if you haven't got that vision, and I guess that's what made the IWW very distinct, that it had the most developed, in a sense, the vision of the entire American socialist movement, possibly the world socialist movement at one time. How do we make that reality? And that's just a question to everybody, really, because I think probably the vast majority of people in this room would like it to be a vision that was shared by vast numbers of the labour and trade union.
On that question, we'll take a quick break.
There's no welfare union because people feel it's they feel it's such a temporary job that they don't really push it any further forward. So that's my experience. What does anyone else have different experiences or any thoughts on that? Oh,
yeah. Well, I work as a supply teacher, partly through that's the way things panned out, and partly through choice. And what I've actually found is I was a member of the EIS and I left in disgust because about 2.5 years ago now they cut a deal with the Scottish Government. For full-time members they would protect their pensions as long as people who were working supply. The way it works is over about an 8-year period you get an increase in your pay annually. and what they done was they actually cut us back to year zero on the pay scale, and I'm now at present between about £12 and £14 a day worse off. So that's my experience of the union. I don't even need a boss to put one over on us after the union to do it.
Yeah, on you go.
I'm still in the EIS. But I think what you're talking about is the way the union does disappoint the membership. And I think one of the things in the EIS is the really poor turnout in ballots. So you can have from like 51% down to maybe 23% actually vote. And then of that, there's about 97% of those people that vote that are voting to protect conditions. So they're actually taking a more left of centre position. So it's people have just walked with their feet, and the whole thing is crumbling, I think, in that way. So although you're giving an example of a really, one of the many sellouts that there's been, I think it's typical of all unions. I mean, in my workplace, we had a rep, and we found that the role of the rep was being abused in the sense that people took it to get promoted. It was like a feather in your cap if you had the experience of industrial organising, and to get rid of that, because all the secrets were going up with them about who was active and so on. To get rid of that, we split up the role, which is a bit like what Nick was talking about, the parallel union, and it's like a ghost union. It's like there's another way of organising within a structure that's recognisable, but we're doing a much more shared kind of experience of the union. So we split up the rep role between 6 or 7 people, and it meant that when the boss came to speak to the rep, there was no rep, and we just said, well, I'm not the rep. So there was no one actually that could get pinned down and manipulated or something like that. But in my workplace, we have unison members who don't have any representation there, and I've tried to represent them to unison. So the idea of the one big union, and I'm an EIS member, but I'll phone up the unison people, and they don't get back to me. There's no, there should be a trade union congress approach, where everyone helps, but that doesn't actually happen in reality either. So there's a lot wrong out there, and potentially it could be fantastic, but in reality, it's people grumbling, and it never really, is able to. The mechanism isn't there to take it effectively forward, I would say. And so people are leaving.
Yeah, it reminds me of the refrain when the boss and the police came to arrest the Wildleys. They asked, "Who's your leader?" And they said, "We're all leaders." And they all got shot, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But in this case, I guess you're going to be shot. You're saying none of us are leaders. It's kind of an interesting opposite, but also perhaps in the same tradition.
It's kind of a symptom of the workplace in a way that there's a sense that if you stick your head up, other people don't really want to know you. They don't want to be associated with you. I've heard this from other schools as well, and I just gave them the advice as well to split up the rep's job, and then nobody is in that position. When it comes to negotiations, we deal with the next level up at union level, who's an outsider, and that person is able to come in with a bit of leverage. But within the branch, there's just it's a kind of, there's apathy, but there's also quite a lot of bullying and intimidation from management. So as a worker, you're in this kind of brutality that is very difficult to to be one person, you know, fighting. It's much better to have more people in there doing it.
So there's, talking about education, as a childcare worker, I was dealing with the workers' issues and the women's issues because it's very largely a woman's profession. And so I was kind of wondering, from your experience with the new unionism or the more grassroots unionism, the workers' rights and women's rights have always been kind of on a parallel track also. And there's been, historically, been some problems in how those are integrated. And, you know, so what has your experience been in your research and your practical experience with class and gender issues and how they intersect?
Well, they're complex. There are many unions, obviously, that have members that have, most members have families and so forth. It depends on which place and country that people are living in. One of the cases with respect to India, for instance, you have family members of workers. In many instances, they're men and women workers, but with women, there's still traditional family social organization. Women are at home and their lives are destroyed by strikes and so forth, or lockouts in many instances. And the union is highly interested in the fate of not just the production of goods, cars, or what have you, but also social reproduction, seeing that work at home also matters to the industry and so forth. But the cases are so wide and disparate that I think we could probably, I could provide examples that are drawn from actually workers themselves who are engaged in struggles of different types. For instance, in Australia and elsewhere, where gender and women's issues are very important and integrated into the policy initiatives. Most of the cases in this collection are, in fact, examples where you have a lot of migrant workers, for instance, in the UK, in the cleaners branch, made up primarily of men, but also women to a large extent. And these are questions that are constantly revisited. But there isn't any standard necessarily from an organizational point of view of the IWW that is imposed, because these are in some ways reflective of IW types of syndicalist organization. But there isn't, they're disparate in terms of the kinds of struggles that each of them are involved in. Coal miners tend to be male, but they're very much concerned with the conditions of women and questions of child care at home and so forth, air pollution and other cases as well. Also, there's been a growth, certainly in the domestic service sector, where you have, as was mentioned, there's a growth of syndicalist structures, but none in this collection. That's included in this collection. Do you have any examples?
From my own experience?
Of syndicalist type organizations that include.
Well, you remember what Paul was saying in France about how the CNT, wasn't it? Yeah. That they were really, so explicit in how they were supporting these women workers. It was so far beyond just the rhetorical side of things, They were trying to really help them out, and so all the complexities of dealing with their work lives, with their home lives, and practical issues of transportation and childcare and so on. So that really seemed, and Fabian visited us last year and was talking about this, and has written a whole paper on it. And it's just, it can be done on such a practical level, and it integrates the theory and the practice so well. But it has to be a commitment, and I think that most of us have that experience of things just sort of sounding good on paper, but how do you really make it meaningful for people, and how are you really taking it seriously? So I think there are those examples, and we have to encourage people when we see that's happening, because it's, I think, women just get to a point where you sort of consider yourself second class, and that's just the way it is, you know. But it certainly shouldn't be there.
It's definitely an issue in these organizations. Absolutely.
Yeah, perhaps, you know, could you sort of reflect maybe on recent US labour movement experience? I'm just thinking things like the Justice for Janitors campaign, which seemed to be quite effective, rank and file, bottom-up form of radical union organising, didn't it? Because on the one hand it challenges employers, but it also challenges union leaders as well, doesn't it? But it doesn't seem to have been sort of replicated to, you know, it was an initially quite effective campaign, wasn't it? You know, any thoughts on why that might be the case? Is it because of entrenched union leadership, powerful employers, vulnerable workers, for example, which, you know, the kind of people that Justice for Janitors was focusing on really, you know, were the employees of hollowed out corporations, really, weren't they? You know, subcontracted workers, that sort of thing, really. And is that not the area really that, you know, could be focused on to, you know, to stimulate radical unionism?
The Justice for Janitors campaign is continuing. The Service Industrial Employees Union is continuing to try to mobilize custodial and maintenance workers as well as building attendants in major cities. Mind you, many of these jobs were once already unionized, but the SEIU had abandoned that in favor of healthcare type organizing, which they saw as more efficient in terms of building numbers. The focus was always on how do we get more members with respect to the SEIU. We'll worry about conditions later. You know, I think that the example of the Justice for Janitors campaign is an important one. I think there is a high level of, there's a level of worker environment. I'm not so sure how high it is in terms of the degree to which it is a campaign that's led by organizers who are third parties in some ways. It is absolutely essential to continue this kind of work. I'm not sure if I would refer to it as a kind of syndicalist model. Very important case. I think there are cases in a number of instances where you have workers mobilized through what are referred to as worker centers that have proliferated around the United States. Justice for Janitors campaign was primarily an immigrant workers campaign, in this case primarily Mexican, in LA, and extended to other areas with other populations. Miami with more Haitian, New York City, Eastern European, and Caribbean. There are differences in terms of that campaign, but the areas that I would point to are the organizations and associations that are formed by immigrant or migrant workers themselves. And those actually have expanded around the United States, and you have a number of workers' centers, and I'm not so sure as to the degree that they represent a model, but there are some that, for instance, Brand Workers United, which is affiliated with the IWW, which mobilizes food service workers who do packaging and canning of food and so forth, anything from fish and other products to vegetables and so forth for restaurants and so forth, that you have high-level exploitation. They're organizing on the basis of a wobbly model. And I think it's called I mentioned Brand Workers. They have an entire integrated campaign with food service workers. It's not affiliated with a established union, and it's got a wobbly base, and I think this is perhaps one of the most encouraging cases. It's based in Queens, but does organizing in Brooklyn, Queens, New Jersey, bakery workers, what have you, highly exploited workers, and also the representation has a large number of women, immigrant women from Latin America chiefly, but also South Asia, Middle East, and so forth, and beyond. It's a very important model, as are other worker centers where there's actually a core of workers, or the entire workforce that are members of this union, are participating actively in the campaigns, go to meetings on a regular basis like this, decide on what the future steps are. It's not top-down oriented, and led by Wobblies, with Wobbly principles. And you know, it's a very important question. And also, I'd like to add, and just picking up what you said, there is a very strong degree to which women's rights are promoted, and I think that's perhaps the best example. It's not in the collection. Daniel Gross, who you may know, has written extensively on that, and also works on the subject, as well as others who are part of that campaign.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, I'm just kind of interested in healthcare workers. I'm a nurse, and I know that there's been some interest. Like, obviously, there's a lot of issues with us going on strike, especially as they're coming in a hospital in an acute setting. So it's not like it can be like an operation or clinic that's going to be cancelled. It's like there's a patient in a bed, not going to walk out. And a lot of the examples I've seen of like alternative forms of action have been more in places where it's private sector, so people refuse to send bills or do invoicing kind of related tasks and stuff, which isn't at all relevant to the NHS setting, so I was just kind of interested in that. We've kind of got a classic kind of public sector frustration where we're a really highly unionised workplace, and a lot of issues come up that people are really angry about, and then the unions make a big song and dance and maybe give us a one-day strike that, if we're lucky, and that achieves nothing, and everything kind of carries on as normal when we get a terrible situation. Also, it's quite problematic in that, anyway, there's lots of problems with workplace stuff, but I was just kind of really interested in, like, first of all, if there's like good examples, and second of all, what kind of actions people are taking. Like, there's obviously just like organising without having any kind of good ideas about what we're going to do in order to try and achieve ends is frustrating.
I think you're referring to tactics as opposed to. I know some people who study the nurses and healthcare workers unions extensively. For instance, the National Union of Healthcare Workers, which is the spin-off of the United Healthcare West, that was was forced out by the leadership of SEIU. This is the same union that helped organize jobs for the Justice for Janitors campaign. There is a tendency to fight for a lot more accountability amongst its leadership. You know, the example of National Nurses United is a new union in the United States, growing, not necessarily new, but growing from the CNA, California Nurses Association. In the United States, there's a tendency to have unions that are rooted, nurses unions that came out of associations, and now they're becoming official unions and existing unions. And there's a whole array of tactics which I'm not really all that familiar with, but I actually know people who I can get you in touch with immediately who are with National Nurses United as well as the National Union of Healthcare Workers, including their leaders, Roseanne Tomorrow and so forth. I have to see me and I'll give you names.
Yeah, there's a really good book about kind of rank and file autonomous and independent unionism in the United States of America from the late 60s through the 90s and early 90s, called Poor Workers' Unions by a woman called Janice Tate. I think Janice Tate.
The last name is Tate.
Yeah,
Janice.
Tate anyway.
Vanessa Tate.
Vanessa Tate, that's right. And it's revelatory, it really is. I mean, all these kind of grassroots movements that we just don't know anything about. It does take into consideration stuff like the Justice for Janitors and so forth, and talks a lot about how there was a lot of really good stuff that was being done, but also the fact that the SAU, the big union that kind of organised that, did pull the strings a great deal on it, and it did actually pull the funding and manipulated a lot of the stuff as well when it appeared to be getting out of hand. So they give a lot of power to the rank and file and put in lots of organisers, but then when it looked like it seemed to be developing its own momentum, they kind of pulled back a little bit. So a really interesting story there. Going back to the kind of gender situation, I think in the global south it's actually organisations actually led by women that are in many ways at the very forefront, the cutting edge of organising that's a kind of a syndicalist type model. I've met some of those people. I mean, there's a international home workers organisation that does a lot of really incredible stuff that nobody really knows about in this country. You know, the home workers aren't really talked about in the British labour movement. And there's something called Street Net International, which is like an international coordination of street workers, street vendors, people that sell stuff in the streets, people that recycle and stuff like that. Again, it's something that's not really talked about, but it's actually in those organisations. It's not that people are doing things for women. Women are actually doing things for themselves, and they're not waiting for anybody else to do it for them. And they're all they've all got their independent kind of dynamics, but they're all in situations where they've got to kind of negotiate and navigate around various kind of NGO type organisations, around bureaucratic trade unions and the government and the state itself. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on that most people, even people that are kind of tuned in and turned on, like I'm sure we all are, aren't really that aware of. And when you do see some of this stuff, you just kind of think, how come we never heard about any of that? Because that's been going on for years. And just maybe because it doesn't explicitly call itself revolutionary or syndicalist or autonomous or whatever, we're not tending to really pick up on it because they're not kind of in the same circles of information, if you like, as we are. I mean, that's often one of the real problems in the sort of like radical labour movement, is that there's lots and lots of things going on and lots of people doing really good stuff, but we don't seem to be connecting very much. I think it's something that we really should do, and it takes a little bit of stepping out of our comfort zone, perhaps, to meet people halfway who maybe would be scared by the fact that some of us are like anarchists and crazy stuff like that. So.
Just to pick up on that real quickly, in the garment sector, there's a tremendous amount of women's organization. I mean, I know there's a garment workers union in the New Delhi region that represents almost exclusively women. That's led by Ananya Bhattacharya. And also there's SIWA, which was the Gujarati-based union that's supported by NGOs. A lot of these organizations, as Dec was pointing out, have NGO support, foreign support. And certainly in Central and Latin America, there's a lot of those same garment workers in the production area. I'm kind of interested in the production area because it does represent an area where there's a tremendous amount of exploitation of specifically women. And there's a lot of growth, and I think that's actually I know Ananya Bhattacharya. She comes out of Jobs with Justice, and she's working with this garment production workers union in the Delhi area, and the case of the Gujarati SIWA, which is also a national union where people are fighting not just for decent conditions, but the right to work, because there's so few jobs available. And they've actually achieved some gains as a result of these struggles, including a minimum number of hours a month, although that may be taken away with the new government there. Numerous other examples.
Pakistan, too.
Yes.
Working on that a lot. Women working, sewing home and so on, trying to organize them.
Yes, I know that. Karen Siegman.
Right. I was really just, hope I don't lower the tone of the discussion too much, but it was really just mention a couple of kind of light-hearted anecdotes from my own working life and how it relates to trade unions and the demise of trade unionism. In the early 1970s, I worked in Chrysler's at Linwood, or as at that time they were actually called Roots, a car factory at Linwood. It later became Chrysler's. And it was a very interesting situation. I suppose that's where I became politicised. But one of the interesting things was everybody was in a trade union. That was the days that you didn't get into a place, a job, well, virtually speaking, if you weren't a trade union member. And I was a member of the Transport and General Workers Union. And the interesting thing is there was at least half a dozen, probably double that, different unions in Chrysler's at Linwood.
and everybody was getting paid different pay scales, of course. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the sister company in Coventry were getting paid more than the people in Scotland, the workers in Scotland. So you had this real disparity, which was always a real issue in the Chryslers. But I remember often I worked a night shift, and it was like 4 12-hour shifts we worked. And I remember often we would just turn up for work, half an hour into the shift, we would be told that's us going home. We were hitting the cobbles, was the phrase used in the days, hitting the street. We were on strike. And I don't know, some of these strikes might have been wildcat. I wasn't too clued up at that point. They might have been wildcat, but most often they were official strikes. And I often remember a meeting in the canteen, and one of the top union guys getting up on a table, very working class, and he would announce to everybody, he always opened with the same opening remark. He would say, brothers and sisters, we find ourselves in an invidious situation. And most of us didn't even know what invidious meant, you know. But one of a couple of interesting reflections on that was the fact that the seeds in the trade union movement's destruction, I think, were there even at that point. And it's interesting because people, certain left-wingers now, look back nostalgically at the 70s as being a time of workers' strength, workers' power. And to some extent it was. I mean, while I worked there in the UCS, the shipbuilding sitting or working was taking place. We all contributed to that every week. And so from that point of view, it's true, there was a certain amount of muscle there. But already you had this separation between different unions and the demarcation thing. And it really did get to a ridiculous point where somebody couldn't unbolt a nut, another member for another union had to be brought to do that. Now I don't care about that. I don't care if that led to the demise of Chryslers, you know. That's not the point I'm making. Even then I recognised the need for one big union, you know, that served everybody's purpose. But there was that point, and also the fact that this argument with management all the time, the business and the disparity between us and Coventry, and the workers don't really have any say, you know, we were just told, well, that's us on strike, we're walking. And I think that's about it really, you know, it's just a real life kind of anecdote. And that was the time shortly after that, the winter of discontent and so on in Britain, where power supplies were cut and all sorts of stuff. But yet, I quite often have a laugh when I hear left-wingers nowadays thinking that was a time of union strength, because it's not quite the case, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I work with kind of young people quite a lot, you know, government places like that. And I filmed a referendum debate last week, Govan Hill, and it's quite good because the old school union guy there and the young sort of trendy Unite person, and just kind of listening to him. I mean, this guy started talking, and it was like you could feel the wind coming off him, you know, just like that. And the real answer just couldn't get it. You know, well, nobody could get it because it was just all this kind of noise, you know, about this. And he was talking about solidarity, and I mean, I could see the guy's point. You know, we have to kind of create this solidarity again. And this young person has to understand what that means, or you know, how you interpret it for the modern day and stuff like that. And it just reminded me when my daughter was at school, you know, when about 15 or 16. I mean, when I was that age, there was unions all over the place. I mean, you weren't a political animal, but you knew what to do if there was a strike. You know, there was a kind of feeling that was in the... But now it's really abstract when young people listen to union people, well, kind of older union people. But my daughter was at school. I kept, they come in one day and they says, we've set up this business to sell things to a school in New York, or Boston or somewhere. I said, what do you mean? And the idea was, they would take Scottish things, like haggis or iron brew or whatever, and they would market them, to kids in a college in America, someplace. And they would do vice versa, like Nike, and so there's this thing, and of course you had to turn a profit and different things like that. It was mad and saying, and I was always saying, why don't you ask the teacher if you can learn how to form a union? He said, because you're probably never going to be in business. When you leave this place, you're going to look for a job, you're going to look for this. So it's going to be more useful to you, if you find out how to protect yourself from business rather than starting business. But, in a school, people totally accept, inculcation of business ideas in pupils before they leave school. But if you suggested a union, they'd be like, oh shit, you can't. Do you know what I mean? That kind of. And I never really got one of them to do it because they would never. I just say, explain to the teacher that you'll probably get a job and all your friends are leaving school, they can't get a job, this, that, next thing, exploitation. And why doesn't the education system teach people how to start unions or create unions? It's just exactly the same as teaching them business skills and stuff like that.
Just a point of information, there is something called Unions into Schools, which is a STUC initiative. I don't know what some school teachers here, have they ever come across unions actually going into schools and speaking to people? And obviously they're not going in there with some sort of anti-capitalist tub-thumping kind of message, but are they going in at all? I don't know, but it has been an initiative that's been it's been in existence for quite a few years. So maybe we can wrangle some sort of wobblies into schools. It sounds more interesting, doesn't it? More wobbly rather than trade unions.
It's interesting you say that, because I'll jump in because in the curriculum thing in England, the wobblies are mentioned in I was told by someone who just finished their A-levels that the wobblies got mentioned in relation to American history. They were not painted in the most positive light. They were seen as the sort of wild ones that didn't. It was the sensible unions that got everything won, and they were just sort of like these wild, gun-toting unionists running about, shooting in the air and whooping and hollering. But
I'm sure they probably called us the international workers of the world as well.
But that they have appeared in some curriculums in the UK even. So, would anyone else like to contribute? We're all almost at time, so it's probably a good time.
Kind of a wee announcement then.
Yeah.
But it's a bit of for everybody else. I've kind of noticed roughly a rough head count. We've got 30% in the room are wobblies. So if you turn left or right, you might be sitting next to a wobbly. You might not know it. But there is a thriving Clydeside branch, and throughout Britain it's building up momentum. So if any stuff that's you've listened to tonight interests you, if you feel you like join a union but you don't really know much about them, you can talk to somebody here tonight. There's a table at the back, you can sign up. Also, which wasn't maybe clarified, and maybe for some people, most people will know this, but the Wobblies are a union for all workers, and that includes people who are students, retired workers, unemployed workers, self-employed workers, and workers in any industry whatsoever. And when I say industry, I mean any workplace whatsoever, because that could be call centres, hospitals, schools, bus factories, anything at all. Basically, you're a kind of wage slave if you work for money and somebody else pays it to you. So it's worth thinking about, if any of these ideas kind of resonate with you and you've not thought about joining a union, or you'd like to think about joining a radical union and maybe work with other people with like mind to kind of help move things forward a bit. And the other announcement was Manny's book is on sale at the back here for £10, but only tonight for £10. Next time you see it, it will be back to 15. So if you want to get it, tonight's your night.
Also, just as wrapping up, I'd like to say thank you again for Manny for coming to Glasgow and giving us some insight on his work.
and thank you to everyone who turned up. Afterwards, we'll be heading along to the Squid and Whale for just it seemed to work last month, so if anyone would like to join us, feel free just to float. It's about 1.5 blocks down Great Western Road. But thank you very much for all turning up tonight. Thanks.